They shot at the coffin, but it wasn't the dead who needed saving. It was the secret hidden inside, and the only one standing in their way was a battered black dog, bleeding and unbroken in the rain. In the chaos of shattered prayers and falling bullets, he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He leapt where others froze, shielding something far greater than any funeral could hide. Beneath the storm and the lies, a conspiracy darker than death itself was waiting to be Who set this trap? What truth was buried deep enough to kill for? What about the dog, not a man who carried the fight when everyone else fell? If you're feeling even a fraction of what this story stirs in your heart, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? What part shook you the most? I can't wait to hear what you think. Together, we'll honor the loyalty that refused to die and the truth that refused to stay buried. The rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets, soaking the cracked concrete of the church courtyard as mourners, cloaked in black, filed solemnly through the heavy oak doors. Their umbrellas, dark and gleaming, resembled a field of wilted petals swaying under a bruised sky. Inside, the heavy scent of lilies and polished wood weighed down the air, blending with the faint traces of burning candles. At the center of it all lay the casket, a deep mahogany gleam, adorned only by a simple silver cross and a tightly folded flag. The man they mourned had been a figure shrouded in mystery and controversy, an officer who died too suddenly, too quietly, for the mess he left behind. Near the altar, Shadow, a massive German shepherd with sleek black fur and sharp, wristless eyes, sat rigid beside his handler. His muscles quivered beneath his coat, every inch of him on edge, alert. He wasn't just grieving, he was warning. No one noticed the way his ears flicked, the low rumble building deep in his throat. No one but the old priest, who hesitated at the pulpit, casting a wary glance at the animal before steadying his voice to read the scriptures. Among the crowd, a man in a threadbare gray coat stood near the back, his face obscured by the brim of a soaked hat. In his weathered hand, he turned a battered military-issue lighter over and over, thumbs striking it to life only to let the flame die again seconds later. His knuckles were scraped raw, and on the back of his neck, a faded tattoo of an eagle barely peeked from beneath his collar. The service dragged on, hymns rising and falling like the ocean tide against the chapel walls. Shadow remained a coiled spring, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on the casket. Every so often, his body would lurch forward slightly, as if restraining an urge to bolt. His handler, a young officer with tense shoulders and darting eyes, gripped the leash tighter, whispering comic words that fell flat against the dog's mounting agitation. At the end of the aisle, the widow sat hunched over, a porcelain figure cracked by grief. Her fingers, veined and trembling, clutched a damp handkerchief to her lips. Beside her, an empty seat. It hadn't been intended that way, but the family had left it open as a symbolic gesture for the brother who couldn't make it home in time, or so they told themselves. The man with the lighter shifted uneasily. His foot tapped a silent rhythm against the stone floor, matching the quick flicks of his thumb against the lighter. Other mourners began to notice him. An older woman in pearls whispered to her husband, who squinted through his bifocals at the twitchy figure. The air grew heavy, not just with sorrow but with something sharp, electric. The kind of tension that animals always sensed before humans did. The Shadow let out a growl, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to seep into the floor itself. Heads turned, a murmur rippled through the pews. The priest stumbled over his prayer, voice faltering. The widow looked up, her tear-blurred eyes following the direction of the dog's gaze. She couldn't see the man in the gray coat. She only saw the casket, only felt a new, searing terror bloom in her chest. The young officer yanked once, sharply on Shadow's leash, but the dog braced against him, muscles locked. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if the world held its breath. A strange, unspoken knowledge passed between the people in the chapel. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Outside, the storm thickened, thunder rumbling low and long. Wind battered the stained glass windows with a frantic urgency. And still, the man in the gray coat stayed rooted in place, flicking his lighter. Shadow emitted a short, sharp bark, a sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the stone chamber. It was a bark of warning, of urgency, not grief. The widow's brother, A grizzled man with broad shoulders and a military bearing stood up from the second row, his hand sliding discreetly under his jacket where a concealed weapon rested. A few others stirred as well. Veterans recognized the feel of danger when it crept in, even when they couldn't see it. The priest closed his Bible slowly, looking down at the casket as if it might open of its own accord. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, he wished it would be better to confront whatever horror lay within than to endure the unbearable tension strangling the room. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lighter slipped from the man's hand. It clattered loudly against the stone floor, sparking a collective flinch from the mourners. The man stooped to pick it up, moving oddly, almost deliberately, as if performing for an unseen audience. Shadow barked again, louder this time, snarling, lunging against his handler's desperate grip. The widow gasped, clutching at her chest. The brother drew his weapon, low and concealed. The priest took an involuntary step back, and outside, beyond the thick oak doors, a distant mechanical roar began to swell, growing louder by the second. A noise that didn't belong to any storm. Shadow knew before anyone else what it was. His body threw itself against the restraints, teeth flashing, eyes locked on the entrance. The mourners turned their heads. The sound now unmistakable. An engine. A motorcycle engine howling towards them at reckless speed. The young officer tried to pull Shadow back. "Stay," he hissed. But it was too late. In a single motion, Shadow ripped free of the leash and bolted towards the doors. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors burst inward with a deafening crash. A motorcycle, black as pitch and dripping rain, hurtled into the chapel, the rider's face hidden behind a mirrored visor. Gasps and screams filled the air. Shadow launched himself through the chaos, his powerful frame a black streak against the dim light. The motorcycle skidded, tires squealing against the slick floor, and the rider pulled something from his belt as a weapon. He leveled it at the casket, and then Shadow leapt not at the rider, but at the casket. The gunshot rang out, deafening. Shadow's body slammed against the polished wood just as the bullet struck. The world exploded into chaos. The crash of the heavy oak doors was a thunderclap against the storm's wail, and the motorcycle ripped through the entrance like a dark bullet, scattering petals, prayer books, and the stunned screams of mourners alike. The rider, a black figure swallowed by dripping leather and chrome, bore down on the aisle with a merciless, unwavering speed. In that heart-stopping instant, no one could react. No one but the German shepherd, already mid-leap, twisted in the air with predatory precision, his instincts blindingly sharp as his body arced toward the casket instead of the approaching threat. A split-second decision carved by pure survival instinct, and something deeper, something that pulsed in his blood, inherited through generations of warriors before him. Time slowed, every breath, every heartbeat stretched into it. The rider did not aim his weapon at the scattered mourners, or the panicked priests scrambling for cover behind the pews. Instead, his gloved hand extended forward, and from under the motorcycle's torn seat, a hidden compartment popped open, revealing a short, brutal weapon primed and trembling with deadly promise. His target was clear. The casket, the sacred vessel meant to cradle the fallen, was, in truth, a baited trap, and someone was desperate to obliterate its secret before it could be unveiled. Shadow muscles bunched, and he launched with a guttural snarl that ripped from his throat like the roar of 1,000 battles, intercepting the trajectory of the blast in a heartbeat too fast for the human eye to catch. The shotgun erupted with a flash of light and a deafening crack, the sound tearing through the chapel like a demon scream. The shot was precise, cold, final, and it should have shattered the casket into oblivion, but it struck instead the heaving, shield-like body of the German shepherd, who met the explosion head-on with a force that hurled him backward in a tangle of blood and fur. The impact threw Shadow against the side of the altar, a sickening thud that drew horrified gasps from those still standing. The casket rocked violently on its pedestal, but held. For now, the motorcycle tires squealed against the slick stone, the rider veering sharply to avoid the chaos erupting around him. The priest, his voice lost somewhere between prayer and shriek, stumbled backward, knocking over the baptismal font in a spray of holy water. Several mourners ducked low, crawling frantically towards the side exits, while the widow brother, his weapon now drawn fully, rushed forward, placing himself between the motorcycle and the widow, his instincts not dulled by years of peace, But the rider wasn't interested in them. His singular focus burned like a brand. As the motorcycle regained its grip, a second weapon appeared. Smaller, sleeker semi-auto pistol pulled deftly from a concealed holster. The rider lifted the gun in a smooth, soulless arc, lining up for a second shot. But Shadow, battered, bleeding, and impossibly still alive, dragged himself upright with a snarl that reverberated against the chapel walls. A living testament to loyalty forged beyond comprehension. Blood dripped steadily from a gaping wound along his flank, staining the marble floor in dark, sticky pools. Yet his eyes, wild, bright, furious, never wavered from his purpose. He staggered forward, each step a battle against collapse, muscles trembling, vision blurring, but will unbroken. His hackles raised, his teeth bared in a snarl so deep it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. In the rider's moment of recalibration, Shadow lunged again, a black missile of pain and fury, and crashed into the front wheel of the motorcycle with a force born of The bike lurched sideways, momentum lost, and the rider fought to regain control. But the slippery stone betrayed him. The motorcycle skidded out from under him, slamming hard into a pew with a bone-crunching noise that silenced even the storm outside. The rider was thrown clear, landing in a heap near the altar, weapon clattering from his grasp. Shadow collapsed beside the wreckage, his willing it to remain untouched. Officers in the crowd surged forward now, some reaching for handcuffs, others checking for weapons. But chaos still reigned supreme. The widow sobbed openly, her cries raw and unfiltered, clutching the pew before her as if it could anchor her to a reality that made no sense. Somewhere beneath the casket, a low, metallic clinking sound echoed something loose, something shifting. No one noticed it yet, too busy scrambling to subdue the assailant and tend to the wounded. The man in the gray coat, the one with the battered lighter, remained motionless at the back of the church, his face a pale mask of horror as he stared not at the rider, but at the casket. Shadow handler, heart hammering in his chest, dropped to his knees beside the wounded dog, hands trembling as he tried to assess the damage. Blood soaked into his uniform, staining it in a grim tribute to the sacrifice just made. "Stay with me, boy," he whispered hoarsely. The leash snapped clean in two, dangling uselessly from his wrist. "Stay." But Shadow attention was elsewhere. His body heaved with every tortured breath, yet his head remained fixed toward the center aisle, the battered casket standing solemn amid the wreckage. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. As officers finally subdued the rider, wrestling him to the ground with a ferocity fueled by rage and terror, the priest stepped forward again, almost hypnotically, approaching the casket as if drawn by an unseen hand. His fingers, trembling, brushed against the wood. A new smell began to rise, something acrid, sharp. The faint, undeniable scent of gasoline spilled somewhere in the confusion. The lighter, now abandoned on the floor, gleamed under the flickering chandelier light, its metallic casing a sinister beacon. The priest's hand hovered over the edge of the casket, his face drawn tight with dread. Behind him, the man in the gray coat took an unfinished step forward, lips moving silently in some unfinished prayer or curse. Shadow tried to bark, tried to move, but his strength failed him. His body slumped heavily to the floor, and still his eyes, those sharp, wounded eyes, never left the casket. The wind howled louder now, battering the ruined doors with a furious urgency. Somewhere in the back of the chapel, a woman screamed, and as the priest's fingers finally found the hidden seam along the casket base, a soft, almost imperceptible click echoed through the ruined silence. A sound out of place, a sound of mechanisms awakening. Shadow's final snarl, weak but defiant, broke the tension like a gunshot. The click that resonated from the casket was not a sacred sound, not the solemn creak of grief's slow release, but something mechanical, cold, inevitable, a lock yielding to pressure it was never meant to withstand. The priest flinched back instinctively, his face blanching to the color of the lilies strewn along the altar. But it was too late to stop what was coming. With a suddenness that snapped the breath from every mourner in the chapel, the casket lid lurched upward, slammed open by the force of the earlier collision, exposing its terrible secret to the world. Where there should have been a body solemn, still, revered, there lay instead a grotesque mockery of life. A mannequin, crudely human-shapen, soaked in a sticky, congealed imitation of blood that oozed in dark, viscous trails across its plastic skin. A collective gasp tore through the room, a ragged, animal sound that shattered what little composure remained. Someone near the front pew retched audibly. Another sobbed out a hoarse, disbelieving prayer. The priest stumbled backward, hands raised as if to ward off some vengeful spirit. It was not merely the horror of the deception that paralyzed them. It was the implication of the unbearable certainty that the man they mourned was not dead, or worse, was part of something far more sinister than anyone had dared imagine. The widow's brother, weapons still drawn, pivoted in shock, scanning the room for threats unseen. His instincts screamed that the chaos was not over, that it had only just begun. He was right. At the far end of the chapel, near the shadowed narthex, the man in the gray coat moved. No one noticed him at first amid the confusion, but Shadow's half-lidded eyes tracked him, the dog's body quivering weakly against the blood-slick floor. The man's hand slipped inside his coat with mechanical precision, emerging with a small cylindrical object glinting ominously under the fractured light. A second later, with a flick of his wrist, he hurled the device into the center of the aisle, where it landed with a soft, almost innocent clink against the stone floor. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a hiss like an angry serpent, the cylinder erupted in a blast of dense, acrid smoke, billowing outward in thick, roiling waves that swallowed the room in choking blindness. Screams rose anew, sharper, more panicked. Figures staggered blindly, coughing, colliding with overturned pews and each other, groping desperately for escape as visibility dropped to near zero. The riders subdued on the floor struggled against their restraints, trying to vanish into the maelstrom. Officers shouted commands that dissolved uselessly into the smog. The priest, clutching at his vestments, stumbled blindly towards the altar. In the confusion, the widow was pulled roughly to her feet by a pair of hands she could not see, hands she fought against until a familiar voice shouted her name. Somewhere in the chaos, the sound of boots striking stone grew louder, faster, as if someone ran not from fear but toward purpose. The man in the gray coat, moving with uncanny calm, weaved through the maelstrom like a ghost, his battered lighter still clutched in one hand, the other pulling a scarf over his mouth against the choking fumes. No one could stop him now. They couldn't even see him. Shadow tried to rise again, driven by some stubborn fragment of duty that refused to die even as his stubborn, placid head, only slowly, and he collapsed heavily, his muzzle dragging against the cold floor. His handler, frantic, shielded the dog's body with his own as unseen shapes brushed past them, feet thudding and sliding in the smoke. Near the casket, the widow's brother knelt blindly, coughing hard enough to wrench his ribs, one hand pressed to the floor to steady himself, the other clinging to his pistol. His vision blurred, his head spun, but he kept the weapon trained on the general direction of the casket. In the haze, a dark shape loomed, a silhouette breaking the swirling white. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like a whip, deafening in the confined space, but it struck only the marble pillar behind the casket, sending shards of stone raining down like deadly confetti. Through the disintegrating smoke, another figure moved, swift and low. The rider, freed somehow during the confusion, lunged toward the altar, a small black satchel clutched tight against the satchel that had been hidden beneath the false body in the casket, the satchel they were willing to kill for. Somewhere behind him, a second shot rang out, and he staggered but kept moving, desperation granting him a savage resilience. Shadow's handler glimpsed the fleeing man through a break in the smoke and yelled an incoherent warning, but it was swallowed by the chaos. Officers converged toward the altar, pistols drawn but too slowly, too clumsily, hampered by the seething haze and the debris-strewn floor. The rider vaulted over the fallen casket, landing hard on the far side, and sprinted toward the shattered doors. He was almost free, almost. A sudden, piercing bark shattered the haze shadow, summoning one last breath, one last cry to cut through the madness. The rider hesitated, just for an instant, glancing back over his shoulder. And in that moment, from somewhere deep in the fog, another figure emerged. Not the police, not a priest, not a mourner. The man in the gray coat moved like a wraith, silent and lethal, closing the distance with terrifying speed. In his hand now was no lighter, but a blade, slim, surgical, and gleaming wickedly. Shadow's handler caught only a glimpse of the confrontation before the smoke thickened again, swallowing the figures whole. The thud, a grunt of pain, the wet, sickening sound of something sharp finding flesh, a body crumpling to the floor, the satchel skidding across the stones, spinning wildly. The priests, still coughing violently, staggered forward just in time to see the satchel come to rest against the base of the altar, its zipper partially torn open, revealing something metallic and cold within. He reached out a trembling hand toward it, and from the depths of the swirling smoke, another hand larger, gloved, reached for it too. The gloved hand snatched the satchel just as the priest's fingers brushed against its frayed corner, vanishing into the smoke with the speed of a phantom, leaving only a ragged gash of terror behind. Shouts erupted from every corner of the chapel as the last tendrils of smoke began to dissipate under the relentless storm winds forcing their way through the shattered entrance. Officers surged toward the altar, their boots clattering against the blood-slick stone, but it was already too late. The thief was gone, swallowed whole by the night beyond the ruined doors. Shadow's handler cradled the wounded dog close, feeling the tremors still running through the battered body, and in that instant a surge of pure, desperate instinct overrode training and protocol. Shadow's nose twitched against the storm-laced air, catching a scent sharp and bitter amid the wet rot of the graveyard beyond. His body, battered and broken though it was, stiffened with new purpose. Without waiting for orders, without waiting for permission, Shadow heaved himself to his paws, staggering a step, then another, muscles quivering with effort but eyes blazing with feral light. His handler rose beside him, shouting for backup, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. But Shadow was already moving, dragging his battered frame forward on pure will, following the invisible trail that only he could sense. The officers, momentarily frozen by the absurdity of it, a dying dog leading a manhunt, caught the urgency in the handler's voice and followed, weapons drawn, boots pounding against the wet flagstones as they poured out into the night. Beyond the church grounds lay the old graveyard, sprawling and labyrinthine, its cracked headstones and gnarled trees lost in the darkness like skeletal sentinels. The storm raged harder here, the wind shrieking through the broken branches, whipping the rain into cruel, stinging needles that turned the ground into a treacherous morass. Shadow moved ahead, weaving between toppled markers and sunken graves, his nose close to the ground, his pace grim and relentless despite the blood still seeping from his side. His handler stayed close, heart hammering, every nerve screaming against the madness of chasing a ghost into a graveyard in the dead of night. But he trusted Shadow more than he trusted his own instincts. They followed the trail of blood, faint but undeniable, winding through the tombstones like a red thread stitched into the earth itself. The other officers fanned out behind them, flashlights cutting jagged swaths through the mist but revealing nothing except more graves, more shadows. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of their lights, the satchel thief ran, desperate and hunted, leaving behind faint traces for Shadow to collect like a grim breadcrumb. As they pressed deeper into the cemetery, the mausoleums rose around them, looming monoliths that cast warped, shuddering shadows in the flickering beams of the flashlights. The rain intensified, turning the ground to mud, and more than once an officer slipped, cursing, but no one dared fall behind. They could not lose the trail, they could not lose what Shadow had found. Minutes bled together, the pursuit stretching into a grim, shivering eternity, and then, just as abruptly as he had begun, Shadow stopped. He stood rigid in the center of a clearing, chest heaving, tail stiff, nose lifted toward a single, ancient greystone half swallowed by weeds and time. His handler skidded to a halt beside him, nearly slipping on the treacherous ground, and lifted his flashlight to illuminate the weathered stone. The beam wavered, caught by the mist, but the name carved into the crumbling surface was unmistakable. It was the name of the man whose funeral they had just attended, the man everyone believed to be dead. Shock rooted the handler to the spot, a cold hand squeezing his heart in its fist. Behind him, the other officers stumbled to a halt as well, murmurs rising among them like uneasy spirits. No one dared move, no one dared breathe. The implications were too vast, too terrible. The trail, the blood, the satchel, it had all led here, to this grave, this name. Shadow whined low in his throat, a sound of confusion and fear. his body trembling as if some deep instinct warned him that they had crossed into something they could not understand, something that defied even the savage logic of violence and betrayal they knew so well. His handler swallowed hard, forcing himself to step forward, feeling the mud suck at his boots, feeling the oppressive weight of unseen eyes pressing down from the darkness all around. He knelt by the grave, brushing aside the wet, choking weeds with a trembling hand, exposing more of the stone, more of the terrible truth. The dates carved into the granite were wrong. They were recent, too recent, and the shallow earth before the stone looked disturbed, as if something or someone had been buried there only days ago. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Someone had buried something under this name. Someone had hidden a secret so big, so dangerous, that it had taken violence and deception to protect it, or to silence it forever. Behind him, the officers shifted uneasily, weapons tightening in nervous grips, every man and woman sensing the same unspoken horror. The storm raged on, lightning flashing in jagged bursts that briefly illuminated the clearing in a stark, monochromatic nightmare. In that stark light, for a heartbeat, the gravestones seemed to lean inward, as if they too were watching, waiting. And Shadow, faithful even to the edge of death, whimpered again and pawed weakly at the disturbed earth, scattering clods of wet dirt across the cracked stone. His handler knelt lower, brushing his fingers along the loose soil, feeling the soft give beneath, feeling the undeniable presence of something hidden just inches below the surface. He turned, about to call for the others to bring equipment, to start digging, but before he could form the words, a sound split the night. A low, grinding rumble, mechanical and menacing, vibrating up through the ground itself. The grinding rumble vibrated through the soaked ground like the growl of something ancient stirring in its grave. And all at once the officers snapped to high alert, weapons raised, eyes scanning the dense tree line that ringed the clearing. Shadow's handler shielded the dog instinctively, heart hammering against his ribs as the noise grew louder, closer, unmistakably mechanical. From the darkness beyond the cemetery's edge, headlights bloomed like twin malevolent eyes, slicing through the mist and rain, casting monstrous, shifting shadows across the broken stones. A black SUV, armored and mud-splattered, crashed into view, tires churning the wet earth, engine roaring like a beast let off its leash. Without waiting for orders, the officers scattered into cover, flanking the vehicle with practiced precision. But it was clear that whoever had come was not here to negotiate. The SUV screeched to a halt mere feet from the grave, the doors exploding open almost before it had fully stopped, and out poured figures clad in black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind visors and scarves, rifles raised in a synchronized deadly ballet. The handler pressed himself low beside Shadow, his mind racing. These weren't local police. They weren't even federal agents. They moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of private contractors' ghost units that operated beyond the law, for money, for secrets, for power. And they were here, for whatever lay beneath that disturbed grave. A sharp voice barked a command in a language the handler couldn't immediately place, and three of the black-clad figures advanced toward the gravestone, ignoring the officers' shouted warnings to halt. Tension crackled through the clearing like an electric current. In that suspended moment before violence, before the inevitable eruption of blood and fire, the handler's mind flashed back to the gravestone, to the name etched there, to the impossible realization twisting tighter around his gut. The man whose funeral they had attended, the man whose empty casket had triggered this chaos, was not simply a victim, he was something else entirely. Somewhere deep within the labyrinthine halls of power, beyond the reach of public trials and official records, there had been a scandal. A colossal betrayal buried so deep that most had forgotten it, or been forced to forget. Whispers spoke of a covert program, of illegal experiments, of political figures who had risked everything for forbidden gains. Whispers spoke of bodies that vanished, of lives erased with brutal precision. And there had been one man, one insider, one witness who had come forward with evidence too damning to be silenced by mere threats. The man whose name now lay carved into this ancient stone. His death had been staged, a necessary illusion to buy him time, to allow him to disappear beneath layers of fabricated tragedy and misdirection. But someone had found out. Someone had pulled at the loose threads of the lie until it unraveled into this nightmare. A crack of gunfire shattered the standstill, a sharp retort that sent the officers diving for cover, returning fire with disciplined bursts. The clearing exploded into chaos, muzzle flashes strobing the night into fits of white and black, rain mixing with mud, with blood, with shouts and screams barely audible over the storm's fury. Shadow's handler crouched low, pressing a trembling hand against the dog's wound to stanch the bleeding, torn between staying to protect his partner and moving to assist his comrades. But Shadow moved first, summoning strength from some deep, unbroken well of loyalty. The German shepherd dragged himself upright, teeth bared in a snarl, eyes locked onto the advancing mercenaries with a ferocity that belied the blood matting his coat. His body wavered, but his will did not. A mercenary spotted him, raised his weapon, but before he could fire, an officer intercepted him with a brutal tackle that sent both men sprawling into the mud. The handler seized the moment, scooping Shadow into his arms, staggering toward a patch of half-collapsed mausoleums that offered better cover. Gunfire tore through the air above them, bullets whining past like angry hornets. Reaching the dubious safety of the stone walls, the handler set Shadow down gently, scanning the battlefield. Officers fought valiantly, but they were outgunned, outflanked, and every second they delayed, the mercenaries inched closer to the grave. One of the black-clad figures reached the stone, knelt swiftly, and began digging with frantic, practiced motions, throwing aside clods of wet earth with his bare hands. Another joined him, covering with a sleek rifle trained outward. They weren't here to kill, not primarily. They were here to retrieve. The realization hit the handler like a lightning strike. They weren't looking for the man, they were looking for what he had hidden. Information, evidence, proof that could bring down governments, topple kings of industry, erase legacies. And they were seconds away from finding. From the corner of his eye, the handler saw movement. The man in the gray coat, still alive, impossibly emerged from the darkness, weaving through the chaos like a ghost. His face was smeared with blood and grime, but his eyes burned with a clarity that cut through the fog of battle. In his hand he carried a second satchel, identical to the one stolen earlier, held aloft like a beacon. A shout tore from one of the mercenaries, a guttural warning, and the gray-coated man sprinted toward the grave, the satchel clutched against his chest, bullets kicking up dirt around his feet. Officers saw him, recognized him, but hesitated, confused, torn between arrest and aid. The man reached the grave just as the digging mercenaries unearthed something solid, a metal container battered and sealed with rusted clasps. For a breathless instant, time froze, the rain hanging suspended in the flash of gunfire, the ground trembling under the strain of so many secrets clawing their way back into the light. And then everything moved at once. The world lurched back into chaotic motion as the man in the gray coat crashed into the clearing, the second satchel clutched tightly against his chest, his boots churning the mud into black rivers as gunfire laced the air around him. Officers and mercenaries alike turned their weapons toward him, unsure whether he was friend or foe, but he moved with singular purpose, eyes locked on the metal container half exposed in the gray. With a roar born of desperation, he flung the satchel toward the officers, the battered canvas tumbling through the rain-soaked air and landing with a heavy thud near the base of the altar-like gravestone. In the split second that followed, several things happened at once. An officer lunged forward to secure the satchel, two mercenaries broke cover to retrieve the unearthed container, and the man in the gray coat, weaponless and spent, raised his empty hands in surrender, his body sagging with exhaustion and something deeper, something like regret. Shadow's handler, crouching behind the crumbled mausoleum wall, watched it all unfold with a soldier's clarity, assessing threats, paths, possibilities. But his gaze locked most urgently on the man who had just thrown them their salvation, or perhaps their doom. Recognition struck him like a blow to the chest. Underneath the grime and blood, he knew that face. Years ago they had worn the same uniform, bled the same battles, sworn the same oaths. Brothers not by blood but by something harder, something forged in fire and loss. The man with the lighter, the man they had dismissed as a vagrant or conspirator, had once stood beside him in places too dark for daylight to reach. His name had been Aaron Cole, and he had sworn an oath to protect the very man now buried under a false graystone. And yet here he was, seemingly complicit in the betrayal that had led to this night of blood and ruin. Confusion and fury warred within the handler, but there was no time to wrestle with either. He surged forward, shouting to his comrades to cover him, and barreled through the hail of bullets toward Aaron. Aaron didn't resist when the handler tackled him to the muddy ground, pinning him with a knee to his chest and a pistol jammed under his jaw. The handler snarled through gritted teeth, rain streaming down his face, mixing with blood and rage. Why the hell would you betray him? For a moment, Aaron said nothing, his chest heaving, his eyes glittering with a pain that had nothing to do with the bruises blooming across his body. Then, hoarse and broken, he whispered, "They have my family." The words slammed into the handler harder than any blow. Aaron squeezed his eyes shut against the flood of shame that twisted his features, his voice shaking as he forced out the rest. "They found me months ago, said if I didn't help, if I didn't make sure the satchel never made it into the right hands, they'd kill them. My wife, my son." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a fleeting second, he was no longer a ghost or a traitor but a man trapped in an impossible choice, drowning in guilt with no shore in sight. The handler's grip faltered slightly, the pistol lowering by an inch. Around them, the firefight raged on, but this space between them felt insulated, a bubble of shared history and broken vows. Aaron coughed, struggling to rise, but made no move to attack. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he rasped. He thought if I stalled long enough, if I misdirected them, maybe the satchel would slip through anyway. But they were always watching, always one step ahead. Shadow, still sheltering behind the ruined wall, lifted his battered head and whined low in his throat, sensing the shifting tides of betrayal and sorrow in the air. The handler swore under his breath, yanked Aaron roughly to his feet and shoved him toward the relative cover of the mausoleum. "You're not getting off that easy," he growled. "You're going to help fix this." Aaron nodded once, a grim, broken thing, and together they turned back to the battlefield. The officers had secured the thrown satchel, retreating behind makeshift barricades formed from toppled gravestones and rusted fencing. But the mercenaries were regrouping, their lines tightening around the grave like a noose. The unearthed metal container had been dragged halfway out of the grave, and now lay exposed under the fitful flashes of lightning, a battered, rust-streaked coffin of secrets waiting to be claimed. The handler grabbed Aaron by the collar, yanking him forward. "What's in that box?" he demanded. Aaron hesitated, then met his gaze squarely. "Proof," he said simply. "Proof that could burn their whole world down." "And the satchel?" "Diversion," Aaron admitted. "A second chance. It's filled with decoys, enough to confuse them if we play it right." The handler's mind raced, piecing together a plan from broken fragments. They could use the satchel to lure the mercenaries away from the true prize. They could still win this, still honor the blood already spilled tonight, but it would cost them dearly. Another burst of gunfire peppered the stone around them, chips of granite stinging their faces, forcing them back into the shadows. The handler pressed his forehead briefly against the cold stone, gathering strength, then turned to Aaron. "You're leading the decoy run," he said grimly. "You owe us that much." Aaron nodded, grim acceptance settling over him like a shroud. He adjusted the satchel across his chest, flexing bloodied fingers around the strap. "Just if I don't make it," he said quietly, "tell them I tried." There was no time for promises, no time for absolution. Only action, only survival, only the faint, flickering hope that somewhere beyond this storm, redemption might still be possible. The handler slapped a fresh magazine into his pistol, checked his gear, and gave a sharp nod. Shadow staggered to his feet beside him, a bloodied sentinel ready to fight to the last breath. And as Aaron bolted from the mausoleum, the satchel bouncing against his back, drawing fire and fury away from the grave, the handler and Shadow prepared to make their stand against the darkness closing in all around them. Gunfire lit the graveyard like strobes at the edge of a nightmare, as Aaron sprinted into the storm with the decoy satchel slamming against his back, drawing the mercenaries into a frenzied pursuit, their shouts and shots fading into the trees, leaving a tenuous pocket of silence around the disturbed grave where the handler and Shadow huddled behind the cracked mausoleum wall. The handler sucked in a ragged breath, his mind racing, calculating how much time Aaron's sacrifice had bought them, how little of it remained. Shadow leaned against his leg, trembling from blood loss, his breath shallow and wet, but his nose twitched with frantic purpose, drawing the handler's gaze downward to something glinting faintly amid the muddy wreckage near the greystone, a battered silver lighter, half buried in churned earth. The handler blinked, heart hammering harder, recognizing it immediately as the same lighter Aaron had fidgeted with back in the chapel, the same lighter that had flickered nervously through every tense moment leading to this nightmare. Shadow whined low in his throat, pawing feebly at the dirt, nudging the lighter with his blood-smeared muzzle, his instincts cutting through the fog of battle with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Something about it was wrong, out of place. The handler knelt quickly, scooping up the lighter with mud-caked fingers, feeling the faint, unmistakable slickness of gasoline residue clinging to its surface. Shadow's nose flared as he inhaled the scent, whimpering insistently, warning that this was no ordinary keepsake. The handler turned the lighter over in his hand, noticing now the faint seam running around its edge, something too precise, too deliberate for mere wear and tear. He jammed his thumb against the lid, pried it open with a snap, and felt something shift inside, not the expected weight of a flint or wick, but something lighter, fragile. He tipped the lighter toward the weak beam of his flashlight, and a tiny, folded scrap of paper fluttered into his palm, soaked but still intact. His pulse roared in his ears as he unfolded it carefully, smoothing the trembling edges against his thigh. Lines sketched in hurried strokes emerged from the sodden fibers, a crude but unmistakable map, annotated with coordinates and scrawled notes in a handwriting he instantly recognized as Aaron's. His throat tightened as he deciphered the meaning. The map didn't point to the grave, didn't point to the chapel, didn't point to anywhere they had fought and bled tonight. It pointed somewhere else entirely, somewhere still hidden, a different location altogether, a place labeled only with a single word: holding. Beneath it, a set of GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude barely legible but still readable. The realization hit him like a second gunshot. The man they thought dead, the man whose supposed funeral had triggered this chaos, wasn't lying in a grave or hidden among false coffins. He was alive, and he was imprisoned somewhere else. This entire nightmare, the ceremony, the attack, the firefight, had been a grand, brutal distraction. A desperate game of three-card Monte played with blood and lies to keep the real prize hidden just a little longer. But Shadow whimpered again, pressing his muzzle against the handler's thigh, urging him to move, to act, to save what could still be saved. The handler's hands moved automatically, memorizing the coordinates, then stuffing the soaked map inside the inner pocket of his jacket. Around them, the graveyard shuddered under distant explosions, and the growing sounds of the mercenaries regrouping, realizing too late that they had been chasing shadows. He rose, tugging Shadow gently to his feet, grimacing at the blood smearing his hands. The dog staggered but stood, stubborn and feral, ready to follow wherever the handler would lead. Wiping rain from his eyes, the handler keyed his radio, barking sharp commands to the remaining officers still loyal, those who had not fallen in the firefight or been scattered by the smoke and confusion. New coordinates, he hissed through gritted teeth, rattling them off with clipped urgency. Poriord extraction. Witness still alive. Move now or lose him forever. Static crackled, then affirmations snapped back at him, gruff, battered, determined. They had lost too much tonight already to fail now. Another burst of gunfire rattled the stones behind them, mercenaries realizing the deception and turning back toward the grave. The handler didn't wait for permission or backup. He grabbed Shadow's leash, twisted it around his fist for better control, and sprinted toward the tree line where the graveyard bled into the dense woods. Mud sucked at his boots, branches tore at his jacket, but he never slowed, driven by the knowledge that somewhere out there, a man sat in darkness, believing himself abandoned, betrayed, lost. And if they didn't reach him soon, the betrayal would become a grave reality. Shadow stumbled but pressed on, his body failing but his spirit refusing surrender, an echo of the handler's own stubborn fury. They burst through the last ring of greystones into open woods, the rain now a near-shit curtain blinding them, the ground a swamp of sucking muck and broken roots. Somewhere ahead, headlights stabbed briefly through the storm backup, he hoped, or maybe another threat. It didn't matter. Nothing would matter if they failed now. He checked the map again by flashlight, the ink smearing further with every second. But the route was burned into his mind. A back road leading out of the cemetery grounds, winding into the abandoned industrial zone where half-constructed warehouses loomed like broken teeth against the skyline. That was where the real prisoner was held. That was where this would end. He tightened his grip on the leash, felt Shadow's labored breathing steady against his leg, and pushed harder, lungs burning, heart pounding a furious drumbeat against his ribs. In the distance, more engines roared to life, headlights cutting across the landscape. From the reading on the leash things, there would be no more funerals today. There would be no more betrayals left unpunished. Rain blurred the world into a smear of color and pain. But the handler's focus was razor sharp. They were close. He could feel it. A pull in his guts stronger than fear, stronger than exhaustion. Somewhere beyond the trees, behind walls of concrete and steel, the witness waited. Somewhere in the dark, the real battle was about to begin. The storm chased them across the skeletal outskirts of the city, the roads slick under their boots, every step a fight against the sucking mud and the weight of exhaustion clawing at their bodies. But the handler and Shadow pressed on, the coordinates etched into the handler's mind, burning brighter with each pounding heartbeat. Through the mist and rain, the abandoned industrial park loomed, a wasteland of half-finished buildings and rusted cranes frozen in the act of construction, their skeletal arms grasping uselessly at the churning sky. The warehouse they sought stood at the far edge of the lot, an enormous monolith of decaying concrete and twisted rebar, its broken windows gaping like the mouths of dead giants. Officers regrouped behind battered vehicles, breathless but determined, weapons checked and loaded, faces grim under the slicing rain. The handler motioned for silence, crouching low with Shadow pressed against his side, scanning the approaches with a predator's precision. It was too quiet. No alarms, no guards in sight, no lights flickering behind the shattered windows. It screamed a trap. Shadow growled low, his body vibrating with tension, nose twitching furiously as he caught the taint of gun oil, explosives, blood barely masked by the stench of mildew and rot. The handler's gut twisted as he motioned the team forward, sticking to cover, leapfrogging across the open ground with weapons up and nerves stretched taut as Wiro. They reached the heavy, buckled doors, their hinges rusted and groaning under the weight of years, and the handler pressed his ear against the cold steel, straining to catch any sound beyond. Nothing. Only the pulse of his own blood roaring in his ears. He signaled, and two officers moved to pry the doors open, slow and silent, just enough to slip inside. The darkness beyond was absolute, a suffocating void that swallowed the weak beams of their flashlights. But the smell hit them immediately, a cocktail of old sweat, gunpowder, and something else, something metallic and cruel. They moved cautiously, boots muffled against the cracked concrete floor, spreading out in a tight diamond formation with the handler and Shadow at the point. Rows of rusted machinery loomed around them, hulking shapes that distorted the light and masked movement. Every shadow seemed to breathe, to shiver with unseen menace. They hadn't gone more than 10 yards when the first trap sprang. A tripwire, nearly invisible against the grime, triggered a concussion grenade that detonated with a deafening roar, throwing two officers backward in a spray of debris and choking dust. Instantly, gunfire erupted from the rafters above, mercenaries in black tactical gear raining bullets down in a brutal crossfire. The team scrambled for cover behind rusted conveyor belts and overturned work tables, returning fire in tight, disciplined bursts. But they were pinned, trapped in a kill zone carefully orchestrated to bleed them dry. The handler cursed under his breath, dragging Shadow behind the shattered remains of a forklift, feeling the dog's body tremble with pain and effort, but also with unbroken resolve. They were sitting ducks. Every approach to the far side of the warehouse, the side marked on Aaron's map, was covered by overlapping fields of fire. And worse, the exits had been rigged. Shadow's sharp nose caught it first, the scent of plastic explosives mingling with the copper tang of blood, and he pawed frantically at the handler's boot, whining a desperate warning. The handler followed his gaze to a series of thin, glinting wires stretched across the ground near the side doors, each one leading to a crude but deadly bundle of C4, camouflaged under scrap metal and debris. No one was getting out that way alive. Despair clawed at the handler's throat as he radioed the team, barking terse warnings about the traps, about the impossibility of retreat. Pinned from above, cut off from escape, it was a death sentence. An officer near the front screamed as a bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him backward into a heap of rusted chains. Another burst of gunfire shredded the edge of a workbench, forcing the others lower, shrinking their world smaller and smaller under the relentless onslaught. And in that desperate moment, when survival seemed no longer a question but a fading memory, Shadow moved. Summoning strength from a place untouched by pain or fear, the battered German shepherd slipped from the handler's grasp, dragging his wounded body across the floor toward the trapped exit. The handler shouted, lunging to grab him, but Shadow was too fast, too determined, a living streak of black and red against the dust-choked gloom. He crawled under the tangled wreckage of machinery, his keen senses guiding him where no human could safely follow. Nose locked on the chemical tang of the explosives, every step a razor's edge between salvation and oblivion. The handler cursed savagely, rising into a crouch and spraying covering fire toward the rafters, drawing enemy attention away from the dog's suicidal crawl. Other officers, realizing what was happening, joined him, unleashing a storm of bullets that forced the mercenaries back into the shadows, buying Shadow precious seconds, his paws careful but swift, his teeth seeking the twisted mess of wires anchoring the explosive in place. Rainwater from his soaked coat dripped onto the detonator, fizzing slightly against exposed contacts. And for a terrifying instant, the handler thought the whole building would go up in a single, blinding instant. But Shadow worked with a precision no human could match, jaws closing on the correct wire, snapping it with a sharp jerk. The detonator sparked once, fizzled and died. A low cheer rippled through the pinned officers, a surge of hope sparking where only despair had lived moments before. Shadow didn't stop. Moving like a ghost, he dragged himself to the next charge, and the next, disarming each in turn with brutal efficiency, each success tearing another hole in the mercenaries' perfect trap. The handler's chest ached with pride and terror in equal measure as he covered Shadow's advance. Heart in his throat with every wire snapped, every bomb neutralized. But the enemy wasn't blind. Shouts rang out from the rafters, and a new hail of bullets rained down, mercenaries realizing their trap was being unraveled before their eyes, their precious kill box slipping away. One bullet struck the ground inches from Shadow's flank, kicking up a spray of concrete dust that coated his bleeding fur. But he pressed on, undeterred, a creature of sheer, unbreakable will. Finally, the last charge lay before him, the main trigger linked to the largest explosive near the primary exit. If he failed here, if he triggered this one, the entire warehouse would collapse, burying rescuers and prisoner alike under a mountain of rubble. The handler locked eyes with Shadow across the killing floor, a silent prayer passing between them, and Shadow lunged forward one last time, jaws closing over the final wire as the enemy above screamed and bullets tore the air to shreds. The final wire snapped under Shadow's bloodied jaws, just as a mercenary's bullet clipped the ground inches from his hind legs, and for a breathless instant the entire world seemed to pause, suspended between annihilation and survival. But then the explosives fizzled harmlessly, the kill zone dismantled by the battered German shepherd's impossible courage. A roar of victory rose from the pinned officers as they surged from cover, guns blazing, pushing back the remaining mercenaries in a brutal counterattack fueled by rage and desperation. And the handler vaulted from his position behind the mausoleum wreckage, sprinting toward Shadow with his heart in his throat. He scooped the trembling dog into his arms, murmuring broken words of gratitude into his matted fur even as bullets screamed past them and bodies fell in the mud around them. Officers fought tooth and nail through the wreckage, clearing a bloody path toward the far end of the warehouse where, behind a half-collapsed wall, the true prize awaited the hidden cell where the missing witness was being kept. The handler, carrying Shadow against his chest, led the charge, battering through twisted metal and fallen beams until they reached a reinforced steel door half buried in debris. Explosives were set, a hasty countdown barked over the radios, and, with a thunderous blast that shook the bones of the earth itself, the door crumpled inward. Flashlights stabbed into the darkness beyond, illuminating a narrow chamber lined with rusted iron bars and reeking of mold and despair. And there, shackled to the wall by heavy iron cuffs, sat the man they had been chasing ghosts to find, his face gaunt but defiant, his eyes burning with a survivor's fire that no cage could extinguish. Officers surged forward, bolt cutters snapping the chains, hands lifting the wasted body carefully, reverently. But it was the handler who noticed it first, the way the man cradled his side protectively, the faint gleam of something metallic under his torn shirt. And when they pulled him free of the shadows, the truth became clear. Embedded just beneath the skin of his left ribcage was a small, surgical incision barely closed over a bulge the size of a coin. And without hesitation, the handler pressed his fingers against it, feeling the unmistakable hard edge of something foreign, something hidden. The witness coughed, voice rasping from disuse but steady, and managed to choke out, "It's inside." The witness hadn't merely been protecting knowledge or documents. He had become the vault himself, carrying within his flesh the most damning secret of all. A microchip embedded in his body, storing data so sensitive it couldn't be entrusted to any device or network. Data that could topple governments, expose conspiracies, rip the mask off the darkest corridors of power. They didn't have time to marvel or mourn. The handler barked into his radio, demanding an immediate medevac and extraction team, ordering the perimeter locked down tighter than a noose. But even as he spoke, even as hope began to flicker in the bruised and bloodied hearts of the men around him, the air changed. It was subtle at first, a ripple of wrongness sliding over the broken warehouse like a dark tide. And then the footsteps came, deliberate and unhurried, boots striking concrete with the confidence of a man who believed himself invincible. From the shattered entrance of the warehouse, framed against the lightning-ravaged sky, a new figure appeared, untouched by the grime and blood that coated everyone else. His tailored suit pristine under a long black coat that flapped in the storm winds like the wings of some monstrous bird. The handler recognized him instantly, bile rising in his throat. He was no soldier, no mercenary. He was worse, a high-ranking government official, a man whose name was whispered with equal parts fear and disgust in the back rooms of power. The same man who had orchestrated the sham funeral, the falsified death, the cascade of lies that had led them here. His face was smooth, almost serene, his eyes cold and empty as he surveyed the carnage before him. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost amused. "You've done well," he said, stepping carefully over bodies and debris, his hands casually tucked into his coat pockets. "Truly, you have. But I'm afraid this ends here." The handler leveled his weapon at the man's chest, teeth bared in a snarl. But the official didn't flinch. Around him, more figures emerged from the shadows, mercenaries in darker, heavier gear than the first wave, professionals, their weapons gleaming under the flickering lights. They surrounded the broken team in a tightening ring, their faces hidden behind black masks, their rifles trained on every living soul in the room. The handler's mind raced, calculating odds, escape routes, but every avenue closed one by one under the steely gaze of the newcomers. They weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to capture. They were here to erase, to cleanse the stain of failure and tie off the loose ends with bullets and silence. The official moved closer, his polished shoes leaving no prints in the muck, until he stood mere feet from the handler and the witness, his smile thin and predatory. "Hand him over," he said softly, almost kindly, "and I'll make it quick." No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder and the ragged breathing of the wounded and the dying. Shadow, still cradled in the handler's arms, growled low and fierce, the sound vibrating against the handler's ribs like a final, defiant heartbeat. The handler tightened his grip on his weapon, finger curling against the trigger, ready to make his last stand, ready to bleed out in the mud and ruin rather than betray everything he had fought for. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a fight they could win with guns alone. The warehouse stood frozen in a tableau of death, the circle of mercenaries tightening like a noose around the battered remnants of the rescue team, their weapons steady, their faces obscured behind black masks as if shame could not touch them, only duty, only orders. The handler's finger tightened against the trigger, his mind calculating the first shot he would take, the last shot he would take, because there would be no survivors if he moved first. No chance of saving the witness or Shadow or himself, only the cold comfort of dying with his principles intact. The official took another step closer, his smile razor thin, one hand slipping into his coat as if reaching for a cigarette, a gesture so casual it mocked the gravity of the moment. But the handler saw the truth gleaming under the tailored folds, a remote detonator, sleek and deadly, a final insurance policy against failure. His blood turned to ice as he realized the depth of the trap. They hadn't just come to kill, they had come to erase, to bury not just the men but the truth itself under a pile of smoking rubble. Somewhere in the shadows near the destroyed machinery, a glint caught the handler's eye, a cylindrical object tucked against a support beam, the faint blinking light of an armed explosive barely visible through the grime. His heart seized as he grasped the enormity of it. Even if they surrendered, even if they handed over the witness, the official had already decided their fate. There would be no trials, no testimonies, only ashes. Shadow shifted weakly in his arms, his battered body racked with tremors. But when the handler met his dog's gaze, he saw no fear there, only a fierce, stubborn light burning against the darkness closing in. Somehow, impossibly, Shadow understood, and before the handler could stop him, Shadow, with a final surge of desperate strength, the German shepherd tore free from his grasp, hitting the ground in a stumbling sprint, his claws scraping against the wet concrete, his blood leaving a trail like a torn banner behind him. Time fractured into 1,000 shards of motion, the official's eyes widening in surprise, the mercenaries shouting warnings, rifles snapping up to track the charging dog, but Shadow was faster. He barreled through the broken battlefield with reckless, savage determination, weaving through gunfire that sparked against the floor and ricocheted off rusted beams, ignoring the pain tearing through his body with every stride. The handler shouted, a raw, broken sound that barely registered in the chaos. But Shadow didn't falter. He threw himself across the final stretch of concrete, colliding with the explosive planted near the support beam with a force that jarred the entire warehouse. The detonator slipped from the official's hand, clattering against the floor, a heartbeat of pure, terrible silence yawning open in its wake. And then Shadow, with his last reserve of life, his last act of defiance, used his mangled body to shove the explosive sideways, rolling it across the floor directly toward the feet of the official and the mercenaries closing around him. The official's face twisted in a mask of horror and rage as he lunged for the detonator. But he was too slow. The bomb detonated in a roar of fire and shrapnel that punched the air from the handler's lungs and hurled bodies like broken dolls across the crumbling warehouse. The world dissolved into light and pain and a sound so loud it became silence. When the handler staggered upright, moments or minutes later, coughing blood and ash from his battered lungs, the battlefield had been transformed. The mercenaries were gone, shredded or buried under twisted metal and falling concrete. The official's body lay twisted and broken near the epicenter of the blast, his polished shoes charred, his fine coat reduced to smoking tatters. The air reeked of burnt plastic, scorched flesh, and the acrid bite of justice long denied. Officers stumbled through the debris, dragging wounded comrades free, pulling the witness into the shelter of a collapsed wall. But the handler's eyes searched only for one thing, one soul among the wreckage. He found Shadow near the center of the blast, his black fur scorched, his body still, his lifeless form cradled in a pool of blood and ash. Kneeling beside him, the handler placed a shaking hand on the dog's flank, feeling no breath, no heartbeat, only the lingering warmth of a life spent entirely in service, in loyalty, in love. Hot tears carved tracks down the grime on his face as he bent his head, forehead resting against Shadow's still body, whispering a broken thank you that the world would never hear. Around them, the remnants of the team gathered, battered and bloodied but alive, forming a silent honor guard for the fallen. The witness, cradling his wounded side, stood shakily and removed a small blade from one of the officer's belts, cutting carefully into the skin over his ribcage. From within, he extracted the microchip, slick with blood but intact, and placed it reverently into the handler's outstretched hand. That tiny shard of technology, so small it could vanish between two fingers, possessed the power to unravel decades of lies, to expose the corruption that had almost swallowed. The handler closed his fist around it, feeling the weight of all they had lost and all they had gained. Outside, the storm finally began to break, the rain thinning to a mist as the first pale fingers of dawn clawed their way over the ruined horizon. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, a promise of reinforcements, of witnesses, of truth finally clawing its way into the light. The handler rose slowly, cradling Shadow's body against his chest once more, his steps sure and steady as he led the broken column of survivors out of the shattered warehouse and into the bleeding dawn. Shadow's sacrifice had bought them this moment, this fragile sliver of freedom, this chance to set right what had been so horribly wrong. His blood had not been spilled in vain. His spirit would not be forgotten. As they emerged into the cold, damp morning, battered but unbroken, the handler looked up at the gray sky and whispered a final salute. For truth, for loyalty, for the only kind of honor that mattered, the kind you bled for. If this story moved you, if Shadow's final stand left a mark on your heart, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you can imagine in keeping these stories alive. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment hit you the hardest? Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Every voice matters. Every memory of loyalty and courage deserves to be heard.